Hello, this is video lecture number 19, The Trials of War. We have 4 different sections that we will cover today. The first is the war in the North. In the second one, we'll look at armies and strategies. In the third, we'll look at a crucial American victory at Saratoga. And then finally, we'll examine the social and financial perils that the colonists were faced with during this difficult time. So many troubles beset the American colonies when they went to war against Great Britain, the greatest imperial power in the world. One problem was that the movement toward war and the opening of hostilities produced a sharpening of the social divisions among Americans. The coming of war brought with it the possibility that artisans and people even lower on the socioeconomic ladder would gain more power. As Governor Morris's observations show, some upper-class patriots were bothered that less politically influential lower-class patriots would use the Revolutionary War to increase that power. The Revolution's opponents exploited the contradictions between revolutionary appeals to liberty and revolutionary leaders' own continuing devotion to race inequality. Lord Dunmore, the last royal governor of Virginia, sought to strike at the slave system on which rested the power of that colony's revolutionaries, while the London Tory Samuel Johnson openly derided the contradictions of the Patriots' claims. As the imperial crisis escalated, moderates were increasingly marginalized. The rebels also faced opposition from loyalists and Native Americans, as well as the British. Even before the publication of Thomas Paine's best-selling Common Sense in early of 1776, the middle ground had basically disappeared. An essay series called The American Crisis illustrates some of the many difficulties faced by patriots. When the Continental Congress finally declared independence on July 2nd, 1776, and then explained its reasons for doing so in the Declaration of Independence approved 2 days later, it simply crystallized the thinking of large numbers of its constituents. So let's have a look at the trials of war then in the years 1776 to 78. Our first section is War in the North. Few observers thought that the rebels stood a chance of defeating the British. Great Britain had more people and more money with which to fight. Few Indians supported the rebels, mainly because they were opposed to the expansion of white settlement. The British were seasoned troops, and the Americans were militarily weak. Prime Minister North assembled a large invasion force and selected General William Howe to lead it. North ordered Howe to capture New York City and seize control of the Hudson River in order to isolate the radical patriots in New England from the other colonies. So he is striking at their communication with this plan. Howe and his 32,000 British troops landed outside New York City in July of 1776, just as the Continental Congress was declaring independence in Philadelphia. Outgunned and outmaneuvered, the Continental Army retreated across the Hudson to New Jersey, then across the Delaware River to Philadelphia. The British at that point halted their campaign for the winter months, which allowed the Continental Army a few minor triumphs that still could not mask British military superiority. So let's look at these armies and let's look at their strategies then in our next section. General Howe's military strategy was one of winning the surrender of opposing forces rather than destroying it. This tactic ultimately failed to nip the rebellion in the bud. George Washington's strategy was to draw the British away from the coast, thereby extending their supply lines and hopefully draining their morale in a war of attrition. The Continental Army drew most of its recruits from the lower ranks of colonial society, the majority of whom fought for a bonus of cash and a promise of land rather than for patriotism. The Continental Army was also poorly provisioned, and it was very poorly armed. Given all of these handicaps, George Washington was fortunate to escape an overwhelming defeat in the first year of the war. Our next section is victory at Saratoga. To finance the war, the British ministry increased the land tax and prepared to mount a major campaign in 1777. The British primary goal, the isolation of New England, was to be achieved with the help of General John Burgoyne, a small force of Iroquois, and General Howe. Howe, however, had a scheme of his own. He wanted to attack Philadelphia, which was home of the Continental Congress, and he wanted to end the rebellion with this quick single victory. George Washington and his troops withdrew from Philadelphia, and the Continental Congress also withdrew, and they fled into the interior. And they did this because they were determined to live to fight another day. General Burgoyne's troops were forced to surrender to American General Horatio Gates and his men at Saratoga, New York. This American victory at Saratoga was the turning point of the war and virtually ensured the success of a military alliance with France. France wouldn't come in to this war until they were sure that the Americans could actually win it. All right, so let's go to the final section, social and financial perils. Wartime difficulties after Saratoga included a British naval blockade that cut supplies of European manufacturers, the occupation of Boston and other major cities, and rising unemployment for urban and rural workers. Faced with a shortage of goods and rising prices, government officials began requisitioning goods directly from the people. This resulted in women's wartime efforts increasing as farm household productivity also increased, and it also boosted their self-esteem. And it prompted some women to expect greater rights in a new Republican society. The fighting exposed tens of thousands of civilians to displacement and death. Soldiers from both armies looted, raped, and burned farms. Civilians on both sides punished those they deemed disloyal by imposing taxes, fines, and with beatings. On the brink of bankruptcy, the new state governments printed paper money that was worth very little. Lacking the authority to impose taxes, the Continental Congress had to resort to borrowing money in the form of gold from France. When those funds were exhausted, then Congress also printed currency and bills of credit, and those also quickly declined in value. Farmers refused to sell their crops for worthless paper currency, even to the Continental Army. Either out of pacifism or the hopes of higher prices, farmers hoarded their grains or they accepted gold and silver for their crops that only the British could pay. Military morale crumbled, causing some Patriot leaders to doubt that the rebellion could succeed. The Continental Army also suffered from a lack of necessities. The winter of 1777 to 78 at Valley Forge took as many lives as 2 years of fighting. To counter this falling morale, Baron von Steuben instituted a system of drill and maneuver that shaped the smaller Continental Army into a much tougher and a better disciplined force. All right, this does conclude video lecture number 19. We were looking at the beginnings of the war, 76 to 78. So please answer the review questions that you see now and continue on to your reading.